Hello there, you perfectly lovely people. My name is Sarah, and I'm reading the very final chapter from 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. It's called The 101th Dalmatian. When all was quiet in the firelit kitchen and their 15 pups were asleep, Pongo said to Mrs. "Do you remember that night that we left? How we looked back at this kitchen? Now, look at your legal collar on its peg, ready for you to wear tomorrow, and your beautiful blue coat." Mrs. said, "I am so hardy now, I shall not need the coat, but I shall wear it from vanity." At that moment they heard a little noise at the window, a little scratching noise. Outside, in the midst of a white blur, were two green eyes. It was Cruella's white cat. Swiftly, Pongo let her in. "Such goings on at the Devilles," she said. Quickly, Pongo turned to his wife. "I haven't explained to you yet, Mrs. Our friend here told me that if we could go into the bolted room, we could destroy Mr. Deville's whole stock of furs. Cruella made him keep them all there so she could wear any she fancied. I hoped we might put an end to his furrier business. That is why I took the risk of going into the Devilles' house. Not to be revenged, but to make England safe for Dalmatians." "And it is even better than I hoped," said the white cat, "because it turns out most of the furs weren't paid for. So Mr. Deville is ruined." "Oh, the poor little man," said Mrs. "I feel quite sorry for him." "No need to," said the white cat. "He's as bad as Cruella. The only difference is she's strong and bad, and he is weak and bad. Anyway, they're going to leave England tomorrow and get away from their debts." "Cruella still has her jewels," said Mrs. regretfully. "Mostly sham," said the white cat. "And those that aren't will be needed by Mr. Deville to start another business abroad. He says he's going to make plastic raincoats." "Cruella won't look very well in those," said Mrs. cheerfully. "She won't look very well in anything," said the cat. "You've heard of people's hair going white in a single night from shock. That's happened to the black side of her hair, and the white side's gone green, a horrid shade, and people are going to think it's dyed. Well, I'm glad to have finished with the Devilles." "But where will you go?" asked Pongo. The white cat looked surprised. "Go? I shan't go anywhere. I've just come here. I'd have come long ago if you dogs hadn't barked. That night your pets gave me a kind sardine. They won't turn me out. I'll pop up and find them now." Then Pongo and Mrs. sank into a blissful sleep without a care in the world, except that they did want to know what the Dearleys were going to do with so many puppies. And so did the Dearleys. Christmas Day at the house in Regent's Park was absolutely wonderful. The rather good hotels sent plenty more steaks, and though there were not, of course, enough presents to go around, the pups were able to play with lots of things in the home, which they were not intended to be played with, but were played with ever afterwards. The Dearleys took all the pups into the snowy park, Pongo, Mrs. and Perdita, circling round to make sure that none got lost. And at twilight, Pongo and Mrs. firmly led the Dearleys up to the top of Primrose Hill and barked over a dogdom-wide network. They even managed to get a message through to the gallant old spaniel. For two dogs from a village 5 miles from him made a special trip in order to bark to him, and he sent a message back that him and his dear old pet were very well. Of course, the dogdom-wide barking was relayed. The furthest away dog Pongo and Mrs. spoke to directly was the Brigadier General, Great Dane, over toward Hampstead, who was in great barking form. "There is something very mysterious about this barking at twilight," said Mrs. Dearley. "Do you think they're sending messages?" Mr. Dearley said, "Well, it's a charming idea, but..." Then he stopped. Was anything beyond dogs? Not when he thought of all Pongo and Mrs. had done. Had they not got 97 pups back from Suffolk? Pongo and Mrs. longed to tell them, but they never could. As soon as Christmas was over, Mr. Dearly decided to act quickly, for he realised that 100 Dalmatians was too much for one house in Regent's Park. It was even a little bit much for all of Regent's Park. First he advertised in case any of the rightful owners of the pups wanted to claim them, but none did. For this reason, Cruella had bought all the pups, except those stolen from the Dearlys, because it costs a lot to get any expert stealing done these days. Cruella had paid more to dog thieves who stole from the Dearlys than for any litter that she'd bought. Naturally, people who had sold puppies never thought of them as lost, or did anything more about them. Only one owner turned up, the farmer who had owned Perdita, and he was quite happy to sell her to the Dearlys. So there was Mr. Dearly, lucky man, with 100 delightful Dalmatians. He decided he must take a large country house. Happily, he could afford this, as the government had again got itself into debt, and he had again got it out. At this time, he had been rewarded by an income to save his income tax on. So he had retired from business, except for being always ready to help the government with its sums. One fine day in January, when the snow was all gone, he said to Mrs. Dearly, "Let's drive out to Suffolk and return the little blue cart to Master Tommy Tompkins, and also hunt for a country house. And we'll look at the house where the puppies were imprisoned. Not that we'll take that one." Mrs. Dearly laughed at such an idea. They took Pongo and Mrs. with them, and Lucky came as a stowaway under the seat, because he wanted to see the sheepdog again and be made a captain. He didn't stay under the seat long, and everyone was delighted to see him when they came out. When they reached Dimpling, they went for a walk around the village and met Tommy Tompkins out with the sheepdog. So the little blue cart was returned then and there. Rather a relief to the Dearlys, who wouldn't quite have known what to say to Tommy's parents. They didn't have to say anything to Tommy, as he still wasn't quite talking, though his chuckling noises were at last beginning to sound more like humans than like dogs. The Dearlys saw at once that Pongo, Mrs. and Lucky knew the sheepdog and the tabby cat that came hurrying up. "And now we will find Cruella's house," said Mr. Dearly. When they got to Hell Hall, there was a large notice outside saying, "For sale, cheap, owner gone to warm climate," and the gates stood wide open. The house was empty. The Baden brothers were now in jail for assaulting the man who came to take away the television, which had never been paid for. They weren't minding jail much, because meeting so many criminals was almost better than television, and now they had high hopes of one day appearing on What's My Crime? "What a hideous house," said Mrs. Dearly. "What a lovely wall," said Mr. Dearly. One thing had been worrying him. If he took 100 Dalmatians into the country, how was he to prevent them from running wild? This magnificent wall was just the thing, if only the house were not so hideous. "Suppose it was painted white," he said, "and the blocked-up windows were put back. There's a lovely pond in front, almost a lake." Mrs. Dearly shook her head. But when they got into the house and saw the fine large rooms and imagined them all white instead of red, she began to feel differently. Pongo, Mrs. and Lucky raced through the kitchen and larder, remembering all that had happened there. The Dearlys followed them and saw the furnace for the central heating. Then they went out to the stables. "These would make fine kennels if they were heated," said Mr. Dearly. Then he looked up and saw the folly, and both he and Mrs. Dearly took a fancy to it. Then he decided there and then to buy Hell Hall and make it a beautiful house. "Here we will found a dynasty of Dalmatians," said Mr. Dearly. Mrs. was insulted. She thought the word meant a nasty din, but Pongo explained it meant a family that goes on and on. Mr. Dearly added, "And we'd better start a dynasty of Dearlys to look after the dynasty of Dalmatians." Mrs. Dearly quite agreed. The alterations to Hell Hall were quickly made, and one sunny day in early spring a removal van and an extra-large double-decker motor coach stood outside the house in Regent's Park. The van was for the furniture, the coach was for the Dearlys and the Dalmatians. The nannies had already gone down by car to open Hell Hall. Nanny Butler was driving. She'd added a smart chauffeur's cap to her butler's uniform. Mr. Dearly came out of the house with Pongo and Mrs. Mrs. Dearly followed with Perdita and with the white cat on her shoulder. The white cat, too, was to start a dynasty at Hell Hall. The Dearlys had promised her a white Persian husband. Within the next few minutes, two surprising things had happened. First, just as Mrs. saw the removal van and said, "Oh, there's a miracle," a Staffordshire Terrier flung itself from the van and said, "Here we are again!" to Pongo and Mrs. and hurled itself at Mr. Dearly's chest. "It's a compliment if only you knew it," said Jim, who was standing by the van. "Oh, that's right," said Bill. "Oh, battering ram's fallen for you." "Oh, an eye for him," said Mr. Dearly politely, rising from a sitting position. Pongo and Mrs. managed to quieten the Staffordshire before he paid a compliment to Mrs. Dearly. And then a second surprise thing happened. A large car had drawn up, and the people in it were looking at Pongo, Mrs. and Perdita, with interest. Suddenly there was a wild commotion in the car, and then the door burst open, and out sprang a superb liver-spotted Dalmatian. He dashed up to Perdita. It was her long-lost husband. His name was Prince. The people in the big car were much touched by his faithfulness to Perdita, and at once offered him to the Dearlys, saying that they would be glad of a good home for him, as they were always going abroad and having to leave him in kennels. Prince was delighted. Apart from wanting to be with Perdita, he knew good pets when he saw them. So the Dalmatians started for Suffolk, 101 strong. They all sat up on a motor coach seat, looking out of the window, and many people who saw them pass cheered, for there had been so much about them in the papers that they had become quite famous. And many, many dogs lined the route, as word of the journey had gone out by twilight barking. The waiting dogs barked their good wishes, and the Dalmatians barked their thanks. So it was really noisy in the motor coach. The Dearlys didn't mind. They thought happy barking was a pleasant noise. The Dalmatians reached the village of Dimpling. All the villagers were out to receive them, with the sheepdog, the tabby cat, and Tommy Tompkins well to the fore. The cows were lowing a loving welcome from the farm. Tommy had his little blue cart with him, and the cad pig felt just a little bit envious. But she was happy to know she had grown too strong to need any cart. The white Persian cat, who is now a charming creature, kindness makes kind cats, was extremely gracious to the farmyard tabby. It was the beginning of a firm friendship. At last the motor coach drove in through the wide open gates of Hell Hall. The pond now reflected a snow-white house with muslin curtains at all the windows. The front of the house still seemed like a face and had an expression, but it was a pleasant expression. The nannies were waiting at the open front door as they came to meet the Dearlys. Nanny Butler said, "Do you know that there's a television aerial on this house?" And Nanny Cook said, "Seems wasteful not to make any use of it." Then Mr. Dearly knew that the nannies wished for television in the kitchen, and he at once suggested it. Pongo and Mrs. were delighted, for they knew how very much their smallest daughter had missed it. But during the many happy hours the cad pig was to sit watching it in the warm kitchen, she never liked it quite as much as the other television. That still, silent television that she had seen on Christmas Eve, when the puppies had rested so peacefully in the strange lofty building. She often remembered that building and wondered who owned it. Someone very kind. For in front of every one of the many seats there had been a little carpet-eared, puppy-sized dog bed. That, my darlings, is the end of 101 Dalmatians. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed reading it to you. Now, off you go to your bed and snuggle in with a great big cuddle. Night-night.